Good morning, everyone. That was a soundless introduction, at least at our end, and we're sorry about that. These things happen. I'm Susan Smith. You are in my studio, Stitched by Susan, and this is a live stream of a quilting project. So, being live, those hiccups do occasionally happen. We do our very best to work them all out beforehand, but it doesn't always work. Coffee in hand, you got to check out this mug. Do, 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 do. You snooze, you lose. Can you see it? There you go. I love it. Heavy, lovely coffee mug. Okay, today's project is going to be, it's a scrappy patchwork quilt, and it's a little elevation above your typical edge to edge, but not nearly as far as a full-on custom. So this is a style of quilting that I think will be super helpful to you in your own quilting journey and whatever quilts that you're working on. And I'll give some credits and more information about it as we go. But before we launch right in, please do know that this episode, we're live streaming, and so it's not going to be edited. It is fully and entirely live, meaning there may be oopses and glitches. Technically, we do our best on that, but also meaning that it's interactive. So those of you who are watching live are welcome to chime in with your questions at any point, and I'll take pauses at various times to answer them. Chime in with any tips you have. Lots of times viewers will remind me of things I've forgotten to do, like put my magnets on the quilt. So it's just really a virtual sewing bee this morning, and I'm so happy that you have chosen to join me. So, sorry, Mr. Producer's asking me something here. Okay, something's wrong with my mic. Sorry about that. We didn't catch that in our pre-show, apparently. All right, so where was I? Yes, these shows are aired live. They're interactive. If you would please type QQ in front of your questions, it enables us to search for them. Sometimes there are few questions, but sometimes there are dozens and dozens and dozens scrolling down the screen. So this enables us to pull them all up when I get to a stopping point and answer your questions and comments. So QQ in front of your questions, please. What else? Do give a thumbs up if you're enjoying this episode, if you find things that are helpful, and there's even time to share this with your friends if you have friends that you think would be interested in this style of quilting. And what I'm doing today, honestly, I'm working at a long arm quilting machine, but it would apply if you're working at a domestic machine too. This type of design would also be very useful for you. There you go, Mr. Producer's typing in. How do I ask a question? Okay, a few other places you can find me before we dive in. I do have a podcast called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find it on YouTube. There is a playlist called Podcast. So originally when these episodes were released, they were just on podcast platforms, such as Apple or Spotify. And so we're gradually re-releasing the episodes on YouTube so that you can also see them with closed captioning if you prefer to read or want to read along as you're listening. So at this point, there are not new episodes being released, but all the past ones are being re-released in YouTube, so you can find them there. If there's any you missed, it's a great time to catch up. Also, YouTube, as always, is a free resource, which we all know and love. But if you do care to support this show, you can do that easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/StitchedBySusan. For as little as $5, you can make a one-time contribution, or you can commit to a monthly one if you so choose. So all the dollars that come in through that, we direct right into elevating our equipment, improving our equipment, lights, camera, cables, all the things. So we sure appreciate those of you who contribute. And at the end of the show, we'll have a rolling credit of those who are members and regular donors because we appreciate you so very, very much. Okay, let's get on to today's project. Oh, do you know what? I forgot one more thing that I need to mention. I need to give a couple of credits here. One is clearly to my husband, Dave. We call him Mr. Producer. And he's behind the scenes managing all the things and keeping all the scenes moving and adjusting my mic when it needs it and all that sort of stuff. So huge thanks to him. This is definitely not a one-woman show. It takes two of us, sometimes more than two of us, to get this carried off. And also our son Will, who does the voices at the intros. We didn't hear sound during it today. I'm not sure if you did or not, but on other episodes, you'll hear his voice. And it sounds different each time, and we love that. And then our good friend Dan, who graciously allows us to use his guitar music throughout these episodes. So you have some really sweet listening while I'm doing my quilting. So a huge thank you to Dan for that. Okay, on to today's show. The quilt that I'm working on, can we have a kind of overhead shot? Maybe I should move Stella. In case you guys haven't met her, this is Stella, my long arm. She's a Bernina Q24, which just means the Bernina long arms are called Q series. So that's where the Q comes from. And the 24-inch, this way a little more, the 24-inch is the depth of the throat on the machine from needle to back. So it is a large machine. I have lots of quilting area. But this is the lovely quilt we're working on today. Very scrappy, as you see. Little tiny backstory on this quilt. I call it my sister quilt. I was spending a couple of weeks with my daughter and her family about a little over a year ago. And my sister lives next door, like the property next door. So we could nip back and forth very easily. So we spent quite a few evenings sewing together. And we decided to make these sister quilts. So the pattern is a free one. I put a link in the description, but it's called Apple Crisp and it's by All People Quilt. So you can also just search for it via Google. So the pattern is free. And we started with the same, we had pieces from a fat quarter bundle that we used in the snowballs, and we added to them as well from our stashes. But we started with the same snowballs, and then we each kind of went our own way with our favorite browns and tans and taupes and caramel colors and things like that. And so that's why we call them sister quilts, because they're not identical. Also, the original pattern has borders around the entire quilt, and I opted to do additional squares to get the size I wanted to achieve, but not the borders. I just like that look. So again, not twin quilts, but sister quilts. I don't think hers has been quilted yet, so I'm going to get done first. Can you tell there's a little bit of rivalry going on here? Okay, so that's the idea. Now, when it came to choosing what I want to quilt on this, you guys know me. I love all over edge-to-edge designs that just provide gorgeous texture on a quilt. This is just going to be a couch quilt and get snuggled and used. That's my go-to. However, I do have these giant snowball blocks where some quilting would show up a little bit. And I thought, what could I do that would elevate it a little? I don't want to take the time to custom quilt in all these little tiny 4 patches and triangles necessarily. So what I'm going to do today is actually, I think Mr. Producer is going to show a picture for you. It's from a book by Bethanne Nemesh, and she gave me permission to quilt this on YouTube for you today. And the book is called Sampler Smackdown. And there's honestly a link as well in the description right to her book in case you want one too. But the idea in her book is that you've got sampler quilts, and rather than quilting something that is specific to the piecing, like all the individual pieces, you quilt secondary designs more in the blocks. So you can see the picture here, which gives you an idea where we're going. We're going to make this curved shape in each block and quilt feathers on both sides, and the curves are going to alternate directions, block to block to block, so that you get this kind of serpentine look from the spines when the quilt is finished. And we won't actually quilt the spines. It's going to be pretty quick quilting. They're not backtracking feathers. They're just spineless, and you'll see that as I start quilting. But this gives you an idea where we're going, because I know the prints are busy and it may be difficult to see the actual quilting. Okay, what else do I want to say about that? I wanted to show you guys the backing, because this is so awesome. This is fabric I've had since Downton, since Downton Abbey was popular. Oh my gosh. And I found this in a, end of bolt kind of sale. And I totally love it. And I only had so many yards, so I've hung on to it for just the right quilt. The one I'm working on today is 72 inches square, so I had enough for that. And it's just those same rich golden colors in there. So my back is already attached, so you can't really see it. And it is pieced. And because you can see, the print is not terribly, terribly busy, I was able to cut it right between the letters of the printing so that it looks seamless on the back. Downton Abbey is not snipped through anywhere. So that was kind of fun. Thread choice is another thing we'll talk about for just a second before we go on. Let me grab my thread examples here. Here's what I chose to go with. The front of the quilt, a lot of the tans, if you will, are very, very warm, very golden, caramely colors. And so I'm using, this is Isacord 100% poly, 40 weight, and it's number 0651. So many of you asked me the colors. I absolutely love this. But you saw that my backing, which I've already tossed way out of camera, is a little more creamy colored and not nearly as deeply golden. And so I opted to go a few shades lighter on the backing. So that's totally up to you if you're doing a quilt in similar colors. I just wanted to illustrate that you don't have to have the same color. I tend to go similar colors top and bottom so that you don't have pokies through in the needle holes and so forth. But a few shades different actually works super, super well. So I've got a couple shades lighter on the backing and then this super warm, lovely caramely color on the front. Okay, I think that's all of that. Now, one last thing. There is just a touch of marking involved in quilting this design because I'm not going to quilt the actual feather spine. It's going to be spineless. So all I'm going to do is lay in the feathers on both sides of it, but I want them pretty accurately to be ending, to be merging where that spine would be, because my stitching is going to give the suggestion of a spine. I do want to mark the curve of that spine. Even though it's a gentle curve, and I could perhaps eyeball it, it will look better, I guarantee it, if I have a marked line to gauge by, to merge my feathers into. So I've got this handy ruler, Quilted Pineapple, which has a gentle curve. Okay, hang on a sec. New batteries? Okay. Apparently the mic is coming in and out, so I'll keep going, and if you guys lose me, I'll come back and talk through this again when Mr. Producer comes back with my new batteries. Anyway, I've got this very gentle curve. The ruler is by the Quilted Pineapple. It's her very largest curve. And when I hold it on my blocks, which are 8 inches square, okay, it's this gentle of a curve. It's less than an inch off the center of that square. Does that make sense? So whether you've got a ruler or whether you want to make a template with a piece of cardboard or whether you want to do what I've done many times, which is just eyeball it, just know this, you don't need or want a deep and dramatic curve, because what will happen if it's super deep is your feather plumes will be really, really short on one side and enormous on the other side and won't look very pleasing, right? So you want just a gentle curve is all you need, and because it goes up in one and down in the next, you still get that gentle serpentine effect that we're looking for. Okay. Gonna be right back. Okay, we have put new batteries in. Let's see if the mic is better. So a couple of you chime in, please. Did you get all that information about the ruler, or do I need to go back over it? And while I wait for that, I'm just going to go ahead and start some marking. So very simply, I've got a clover chalk roller liner. Any marking tool honestly will do that will show up reasonably well on your fabric. And of course, this fabric is a little tricky because it's so busy. I experimented a little bit, but my purple air erase marker definitely did not show up well. So like I said, a link to the book is in the show notes, and I encourage you to check out that book. Bethanne has literally dozens and dozens of great ideas in it for doing this type of, what's the word I want? It's not even mid-custom. It's just slightly elevated over an edge to edge where you're laying a design over a whole block. So, you know, it's some more work than an edge to edge because you do have to stop and start for the blocks, but not for the piecing, not the individual piecing. And there's no stitching in the ditch. And in this case, there's no ruler work. And I think in most of the designs in her book, there's not ruler work. There's just some very simple marking like this to kind of get a framework in place, and then you're up and quilting. Are we getting any feedback, Mr. Producer, sir, on the ruler? Great. Sounds like you guys were able to hear great on the ruler. Someone is asking what size my ruler is. Okay, let's see what it says. The QP Curve by Linda Herka, thequiltedpineapple.com, and it says 38, and I assume that means it would be a 38-inch circle if the whole ruler was here. But really, truly, you guys, take me seriously on this. You don't have to have a fancy curve for this. If I didn't want this ruler for other things, I would not buy it just for this process. That's just me. But I've done this several times, literally just eyeballing a gentle curve in each block, chalking it in. That is not going to show. Your eye is not measuring one curve against another. How alike are they? You just need this gentle curve in each block to give you a guideline for your eye. And as you can see, I am alternating them back and forth, the curves, across a row like this. One of the reasons that I love my 24-inch machine is it does have a generous throat space, so I'm able to quilt 2 of these blocks end to end, and I'll show you what that's going to look like in 1 second here. If you had a much smaller throat space, you'd have to do it 1 row at a time. So what I'm going to be able to do is start quilting. I'll go where you can see me. I'm going to be able to start quilting in a corner and do this whole block and this whole block. Then I'll start at a corner again and do this whole block and this whole block. You could, if you're more comfortable doing it, you could also start up here and come this way with your feathers. If that feels easier for you, go for it. I will say this. I have my trusty plexiglass sheets. You guys have seen these before, but in case some of you haven't, my dirty batting eraser, I use a dry erase marker to audition designs on this board. And so I did do that with these blocks. For one thing, to kind of determine, was this ruler a good curve? And also to kind of get set in my mind what size I want my feathers to be. So, you know, if you pack in more plumes, they're going to be longer and slimmer. If you have fewer plumes, they're going to be wider and chubbier. It's a very different look. Not wrong, not right. But it's helpful to pre-decide which way you want to go and have a pretty good idea how many plumes you want to put on each side of the feather. And that gives you just a framework to go by. And if you have a hard time remembering that from this end of the quilt to the other end of the quilt, then keep your plexiglass sheet or a piece of paper handy where you've traced one block out and keep looking back at it to kind of judge, am I staying with a similar scale? Do my feathers still look similarly as you work your way down the quilt and you can't visibly see what you did before? But you can see now how this design idea would also work at a sit-down machine, right? Because you're literally quilting one block at a time. So this is something you could also do at your sit-down machine. You would need a different process for basting than I've used for loading on my long arm, but the quilting design would absolutely work. And you could, if you wished, start at one side and do the diagonal blocks all the way across the quilt, if indeed you had it basted securely enough. But in my case, I'm going to go 2 rows at a time. I'll complete these 2 rows and then I'll advance and do the next 2 rows and so on and so forth. I think I mentioned already the finished blocks in my quilt are 8 inches. So that gives you an idea for scale. Anything else I need to say about that? I don't think so. I think that's it, and I think we're ready to start quilting. So I did not show the... Yes, I will take some questions. I did not show the entire loading process today, but if you go back on many of my live streaming episodes, I go right through the whole loading from the very beginning so that you can see all of that. Today I wanted to get to the quilting because that's kind of the feature of today's show. So if you want more information on my loading process, please refer back to some of the other live and unscripted shows. Okay, let's take a few questions before we dive into the quilting. Pamela, when you get a chance, can you show quilting with a minky or fleece backing? Absolutely, Pamela, and there is one already on in past episodes. I was doing my grandson's quilt, and it was quilting with a minky backing. Now, I spelled minky M-I-N-K-Y, I believe. You see it different from different brands, and I think minky with a double E on the end is the official brand name, so I guess I probably misused it. But anyway, it's that fuzzy, velvety sort of backing. And I did talk about some specific tips for that on the long arm, yes. Savannah, for some reason I thought you were only doing the snowball blocks with feathers. Nope. Each block, whether snowball or patchy, has the same quilting in it. So the whole quilt is just repeat, and then you'll get these undulating feathers kind of diagonal when it's all finished. It's going to look awesome. So 0 stitching in the ditch to stabilize, just the normal basting up the sides. That's correct, Savannah, and I have done that already. I've basted up my left side, across the top, down the right, and I've got my magnetic bars on my front rail, so my whole working surface is fully stabilized, although the front of my quilt is floating. It's hanging down here in front of me. See? There it is. And that, again, is part of the loading process, which I talk about much more in other videos. Tracy, will you be quilting your sister's quilt as well? Not positive, Tracy. I do some of her quilts, but she lives in Canada and I live in the US. So unless we're traveling, it can be difficult and very expensive to mail them back and forth. So it varies. Sometimes she does her own on her domestic machine. Okay, that's it for questions. Let's start quilting, you guys. I'm just going to move my ruler and marker out of the way. Let me just show you, because I didn't earlier, the Clover chalk marker. And it's just got a very fine wheel roller, so it makes a very slim line of chalk, which I like. You can mark with anything that will show up on your fabric. You don't need a hyper precise line, but that is what I'm using. And we'll set the ruler out of the way. For reasons not really known to me, I almost always start quilting at the right, so I'm just going to. And I prefer to quilt my feathers from me away. So I'm going to start at the bottom. And for this first one, I will just be quilting one square. So these are very simple feather plumes. Bethanne goes into the details of quilting a non-backtrack feather very much in her book. You can also find them in my all over feather class. I talk about it too, about the shapes of these feathers. But for today's purposes, the idea just is that there is no spine actually quilted. We're just going to alternate plumes from side to side to side. And we're using the chalk marking to tell us where to merge those feathers together, so that when the whole block is done, our eyes will kind of see a spine, even though there isn't one actually stitched. It's really tough to see my little chalk line. I don't know that you guys can see it at all on camera. But it's there, and it's just enough to give me a bit of a visual guide. That's all I need. I am at the moment stitching in regulated mode, and I have my stitch length set on 10 stitches per inch. If I was doing this on my own and not on camera, I probably would stitch in unregulated mode. But today, because I'm trying to talk also while I'm doing it, I'm going to leave it unregulated. It's one less thing that I have to sort of think about. Okay, so here's the deal. You do have to break thread at the end of a row. So in this case, it was just one block. In the next case, which I'm going to do right next, I'm going to do one block and then continue right into the second one on the diagonal. Got my thread tangled up in my hopper foot here. And this you'll just need to check at your own long arm machine. Make sure that you've got the clearance to get to the front of this block and all the way to the back of the other one, right? So before you start your chalk marking, or before you start quilting, you'll want to know that you've got that clearance. And I'm just anchoring my thread with a couple stitches in the basting, and that didn't feel quite right, so I'm just going to do that again, you guys. By the way, I am working on a series of YouTube videos. They're going to be very short, less than 10 minutes, all of them. A series called Know Your Machine, and it's for little things like this, like know what the sound and feel of your bobbin thread is like when you're pulling up your bottom thread. Like, that is important to heading off a lot of mistakes and frustration and undoing. Know what your thread looks like when it's feeding through the needle. Anyway, hopefully, I'm just busy collecting all the little tips I can think of for how knowing your machine can help make your quilting easy, trouble-free, and putting them together in a little series for you. So this coming week, the first one will be released, and hopefully weekly thereafter for a while. As always, there's an upside and a downside to such a busy print. The upside is the individual quilting stitches just don't show all that much. The downside is it's difficult to see where you're driving. But can you see how this feather is just filling up the whole block? We're just stretching it to fit the whole block, and it's laying this, what Bethanne calls, rightly so, a secondary design over the whole block without regard to the triangles or anything like that of the actual piecing. It's just laying a design across the whole block, and this is just so incredibly much faster than custom quilting in the little 4 patches and in the little snowballs. But it still is, it just elevates the quilt a little bit. And when the whole quilt is finished and you step back and look at it, you'll really see that the serpentine spines, and that's really the secondary design that we're going for. So in case you missed the title earlier, the name of the book is Sampler Smackdown. It's by Bethanne Nemesh, and there's a link right to her website and that particular book in the description right below this episode that you're watching. And that book contains this idea and dozens of other ideas, particularly geared towards sampler type quilts. Locking my stitching at the corner. A little later on, as I get into some blocks that you can see the quilting a little more clearly, we'll take a roving camera and I'll give you a look at them. But the ones I've done so far are so very busy, you're not going to be able to see it anyways. So now I'm starting back at the end of the quilt closest to me, and again I've just pulled up my bobbin thread, taken a few stitches to anchor it. I'm confident that stitching will hold. I'm in a seam allowance, so those 4 or 5 lock stitches, they're just tiny and less than 1/8 of an inch. Those are going to hold, and that's important because there's going to be a lot of those stops and starts throughout the quilt, and I don't want that quilting to be coming undone. Question? Okay, Mr. Producer is just telling me apparently I made an error in typing in my description, and I did not get the name of the book in there in the link, but he has put it in the chat, and after we are off air I will go and put it in the description. So if you're watching this later, it'll be there. If you're watching it live, check for it in the chat. In general, I'm alternating my feather plumes from side to side, but definitely not exactly. You can see that sometimes I'm doing 2 or even 3 on one side before I do the other side, and that's just because of the curve in the spine. You sometimes have to fill in one side a little more. But can you see how that chalked line is super helpful? It would be all too easy to lose your way or lose the shape of that curve if you didn't have a guideline chalked into place. I'm just checking my needle thread. It keeps sagging here beside me, and I see that in the out of the corner of my eye. I'm just double checking that it's in every clip that it ought to be. It's in there. I said earlier that Bethanne talks quite a bit about non-backtrack feathers or spineless feathers in this book, in many of her books actually. And also I have a class, and mine is called the All Over Feather, and it's a free class. And there is a link for it. I think it probably runs in every single YouTube episode. I have that link in the description at the bottom. If you love feathers, or if feathers have always puzzled you and frustrated you, either way, I think you will find this class helpful. I go right through from forming the shape of the plume to how to get a feather to turn corners and lie gracefully beside the feather before it, how to get this spine to look like it's there even though you haven't actually stitched it. All that sort of stuff is in it, even though the application is a little different. It's just an all-over feather that's literally moving all over the quilt top. So check out that class if you're interested in that. And again, a few lock stitches just out in the basted edge. And now you guys, rinse and repeat. Over and over and over. This block you'll be able to see a little bit better. So that'll be a great thing. Pause there a second and look for my chalked line. It is very, 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 very faint. Something I'm noticing as I'm going, I'm having a little bit of trouble stretching my feathers into the corners because of my spacing. I'm not ending up with a feather right at the corner. I'm getting one before and one after, and that's not filling up the corners well. So mental note to myself, I either need to go a little more, like a little slimmer feathers, or a little wider. I need to change up that spacing just a little bit. So all I'm going to do is try to be looking ahead here in just a moment. I'll tell you when it really starts. Right now, I'm looking ahead. How many more feathers can I fit in? Can I squeeze in 2, or is it just going to be 1? And I can kind of adjust the size of my feathers to compensate. And I've opted to go a little chubbier with them. But I want to get a feather right there, right out in the corner. I'm definitely not going to go back and undo the earlier ones. It's just something you can watch for as you're quilting. And it's up to you how tiny you want to go in this little corner. Totally up to you. I don't love teeny, 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 tiny ones, so I just kind of coast out to the corner and call it done. Do we want to do a roving camera, Mr. Producer, or later? I'll just pan over it for the moment. How's that? Here's the one that you can see a little better. I'm going to point out this corner particularly because I've been talking about it. Can I see it on camera, Dave, on my screen, please? Can I see it on my screen, please? All right, let me just see. There we go. You guys can see the corner. So this is where I'm talking about. I did not manage to get my feathers extending into that corner well, and because nothing else is going to get quilted in this block, that's leaving an area unquilted. So this is where I want to make that adjustment so that I get the tip of a feather that ends out here as opposed to one on either side of it. Does that kind of make sense? These are the things I think of when I'm quilting freehand, and it really, really helps to just be looking ahead. So if you can see it in your peripheral vision, great. If you can't, just pause. Pause every once in a while and take stock. Can I fit 2 more in or 3 more in? Or am I just doing 1? And just plan that ahead. So I'll do it again on this one. I don't know that you'll be able to see it super well, but I'll kind of talk you through it. Where I pause and take that visual measuring stick. Where am I at? Right here. I'm already seeing the oncoming corner and deciding how many feathers I'm going to get in there. I'm going to stretch this one right out in the corner. See that? And overall, that's going to look much better to fill up my corner that way. On the other side, I'm still going to fit one more in. Right here. You get it right out in that corner. Much better. Much happier with that. So I have definitely not made a hard and fast rule for myself of how many feather plumes are in each block. But as I demonstrated on the plexiglass sheet, just pre-planning about what size your feathers will be is beneficial. And then if you keep that as a drawing or as the plexi sheet handy and close by you, check back with it, because it's all too easy to do a row or two of these feathers and then suddenly look back and say, oh my word, they're twice as big as they were when I started. That happens all the time. That is so easy to happen. So keeping a drawn one beside you can help you. Honestly, you probably could take a picture on your smartphone too. But I like a drawn one just because it's actual size. I find that easier to refer to. Right out in that corner. Success! Let's go over the logistics again today of what I'm using. I'm using Isocord 100% poly thread in a kind of caramely color. I've got a stitch length of 10 set right now, and I am using my stitch regulator. It's often easier when I'm on camera to just not have to think about stitch length. But I do often love to stitch without that regulator on. 10 or 11 to me is a nice universal all-purpose stitch length. What else? I've got Winline today. Winline brand batting. It is 80% cotton, 20% poly. So a nice little, again, all-purpose blend. You know, keeping in mind this is a quilt that's going to be used. Not yet sure if it's going to live on my couch or if it's going to get given away, but it's going to be used and washed and cleaned and dragged from pillar to post. So I want serviceable fabrics and batting in it. Right out in the corner here, watch this. Woohoo! Stretch. And you're seeing, as I quilt here, I talked about at the beginning, this idea that you don't want a very deep curve. I think the temptation is, I want this very curvy look, and so I need a deeper curve throughout these blocks for my spine shape, but really it's a very gentle curve. Partly because there's so many of them, and also partly because it alternates back and forth from block to block. That makes it appear more curvaceous. It works better to have a subtle curve, and certainly it's easier to quilt the feather with a very shallow curve. If it gets deep, you end up with teeny tiny feathers on one side and gargantuan plumes on the other side, and that never looks good. So keep that curve gentle. In my 8-inch block, that curve is slightly less than an inch off of the center of the block. So it's not very deep at all. Sometimes less is more. This design, like many others, is a great place to be practicing your control of your machine. Can you see? I mean, partly I'm going slow to keep the camera from vibrating like crazy, but also I'm going slow enough that I'm not swinging my machine around the feather. I'm guiding it every stitch of the way. I feel like this is an important skill for a long arm quilter, to be always in control of the machine. That's how you can make these long, long, long feathers merge right back into that chalked line and know exactly where they'll land, or reach right out into the corner. It's much harder to do that if you swing into that feather and just hope that your machine will, you know, land approximately where you're aiming. So it's important. Be in control all of the time. Already I'm looking ahead. How many more feather plumes do I want to get in? This one's going right to the corner. On the other side, there's still 2 more to go. Here's one. Oh no, I am going to stretch it out. There we go. I told you wrong. Sorry, didn't mean to steer you wrong. Change that one on the fly. I'd love to know, by the way, in the comments, if you have thought of quilting a project in this way before. So doing something in each block, but not piecing specific. Or if this is a new idea to you and what you think of it. Again, I've said it already a few times, but it bears repeating. Bethanne's book has many different ideas. This is only one of them. And I have found several of them to be super beneficial. I've used a couple of them in Quilts of Valor, for example. Again, that's an application, honestly, where you often want to do a little something special because it's a special quilt, but maybe you don't have oodles and oodles of time to spend. It's not a quilter receiving it, so they're not even going to recognize or appreciate heavy custom quilting. And also, it is a quilt that's likely going to be washed and used. So these types of ideas in that type of quilt are really, really helpful because you can add a dressy element, you can add this secondary look. Some of Bethanne's ideas sort of take into account the whole quilt, and you're kind of thinking, all right, I can make something look like a star across the whole quilt. And it's subtle. It's subtle. It's not a loud fighting quilting design. It's very subtle in its secondary quality, but awesome, just awesome. One of them that I've done a couple times, it is a favorite. I just can't not tell you about it. It's like a bullseye, basically. You do a feather in rings, big rings. So the biggest ring is like 36 inches or more, and it's kind of offset on the quilt. So you do this giant ring of feathers around and around and around, and then you quilt like a piano key, lines radiating out from it. And it looks so cool on a finished quilt. So cool. I've done that one a few times. Also in the book, Sampler Smackdown by Bethanne Nemesh. Okay, I cannot see my chalk line at all. Let me grab my chalk for a sec and just lay down a little heavier. Little heavier row. Maybe. It's funny, if I pull back a little bit and look at it, I can see it. It's just when I'm looking here right next to my needle, I can't. So if I just stop when I'm at the base of the feather and look ahead, I can pretty much judge where I need to go with it. Pause. Where do I need to go? Okay, got it. And again. I'm also making an effort to keep my feathers inside that base perimeter just a little, because that's where the binding's going to go, right? And the binding's going to cover a little more space than the basting does. So I want to keep my feathers a good 1/4 inch inside that basting line, just so that they don't get chopped off in the binding. Just a few more blocks is a great time to be typing in your questions if you have any, or comments or thoughts. And really, truly, I'd love to know, is this an idea that's kind of new to you? This idea of a little more than edge to edge, but a lot less than custom quilting. And do you think that you'll apply this to a quilt? Can you think of one that you've got in the pipeline that this would work well on? I currently have my ruler foot on. I find the ruler foot to be just, it feels a little more robust in some ways than the darning foot, which is a slimmer, thinner circle. I don't know if that's true or if that's all in my head, but it's what I chose to use today. Often when I'm doing an edge-to-edge quilt that has quite a lot of seams like this, if it was an edge-to-edge design, often I would choose the spoon or cup foot because it glides over the seam allowances very well. But for today's purposes, that was not a good idea because I need the visibility. And on my machine at least, the cup foot is quite large and is not really see-through, and so it limits visibility. And I want to be able to see this little chalked spine. I'm having enough trouble seeing it as it is. I don't want to add that spoon to it as well. So just know that these are options that you have, and I choose what foot I'm going to have on based on the quilt that I'm working on. I do a lot of my quilting, honestly, with this ruler foot attached. I like it. It's sturdy, it's robust, but it gives me the visibility that I don't always have with the spoon foot. But sometimes you do have to make the hard choices. You know, if this was a quilt that had really, really, really thick seams, you want to think about that sort of stuff before you embark on quilting. You know, for one thing, you need to rethink your quilting design. If it's so robust that this foot won't do it, do you need to rethink that quilting design? Again, I'm just chalking one more layer here, because I sure can't see it. I still can't. This one, you guys, is going to be by guess and by gosh. So I'm just going to keep casting my eye up to the corner where I can see the chalked line and do as best as I can to make a nice curve. In an ideal day, I would actually grab my blue marking pencil and just go ahead and mark it with my blue or purple marking pencil. But I don't have it nearby today, and I don't want to stop for that. But that would be an option right here. Get something else and do another marking. I was talking earlier about going slowly enough that you have that ultimate control. Like right here, I want to control exactly where my stitching is ending up. And, you know, if you don't feel like you have that sort of control yet, don't sweat over it. It will come, but that's the goal to keep in mind. And there we are. We are done row 1. Past 1, I guess, because it's 2 rows, isn't it? So again, great time for your questions. I'm going to undo my side clamps and my front magnetic bars, and I want to go ahead and trim my thread tails so that they're not dangling over my work when I go to sew on the next group. And because I anchored those stitches, first off, pulled up the bobbin thread, second, anchored the stitches firmly, I can now just trim them all level with the quilt top. And I have a little tiny set of clips that I adore for this. They're by Kai, but they have a little curved tip. That's the part I love best, because you can just lay that right on top of the fabric and trim without being worried about snipping your fabric like you would with a sharp point. And I promise before we finish today, we will get a roving camera going, and I'll walk slowly over the quilt top so you can get a better look at the big picture view of a couple of these curves. Let's just make sure I've got enough clearance for that front row. Yes, I do. Perfect. So as always, when I'm advancing, I run along the front and I grab both the front of my quilt and the batting. Pinch it and tug a little bit. If I don't, I always think the batting seems to pull up a little bit under there. It just needs a little bit of a pull. It's not hard, it's just a little. As a side note, if you do float your tops like I do, if you're not sure what the batting's doing and you're not comfortable with that, this is a great opportunity to literally just flip your quilt up, right? And make sure that it's hanging straight. Make sure that it's not got any frowning happening. It's not hanging down longer at the sides. That problem will accumulate if it starts. It will accumulate and get worse and worse as your quilt goes on. So nip it in the bud. Okay, batting is straight, quilt is straight, and I brush my quilt down pretty firmly with my hands. I also look along this front edge because I have seam lines. It's easy to gauge, are those going nice and straight? I don't want any stretching on the edges to happen. I don't want any pulling up of the middle to happen. So all those things I'm visually checking for as I'm doing my advance. And now I'm going to baste the side of the quilt. If you have a, let's just put it this way. Some of my clients are better than me, and they run a little victory lap around the edge of the quilt, so that when you've got all these seams happening down the side, they don't stretch out of place. And you could probably see here in the camera a bit, I've got a little bit of fullness along this edge. So I'm going to take that up by either pulling on the area that's been stitched, or even grabbing it with my thumbnail and just tugging a little bit. Either way, I'm just pulling the fabric under the needle a little bit faster. Can you see that happening? And it just manages that fullness really nice. I do not have my channel lock on. I'm just putting the edge of this quilt straight sort of by eye. Sometimes I do have the channel lock on, whatever you're comfortable with, or pin it in place if you're not comfortable, but you do want a nice straight edge. And I do have, let me show you. Yes, see my measuring tape back here? I've got a Long Armor's measuring tape stuck at the back of my machine, and so I can also look right up this side and gauge. Am I coming up to the measurement that I need to? And that keeps me from, veering inwards with my quilt as I advance it each time. I don't always think to say all these things to you guys. They're just so automatic to do as I do in advance. I'm just glancing here, glancing there. Am I at the right measurement? Does my seam line run straight? Etc., etc. All these things work together to give a nice, straight and square result. baste this side before we put the last one on. Again, just tugging a little bit behind the needle on the area that's already stitched with my thumbnail, just to keep it feeding under the needle and not allowing it to push out in front at all. Again, if you're not comfortable doing that or not exactly sure how much to pull it up, just drop some pins in first so that you know you have checkpoints along the way. Let me get my clamps and my magnets on, and then we'll stop for a sip of water and some questions. Last clamp. Okay. Questions. Water. Diane and Selena gave me this lovely water mug. There we go. I've showed it a couple times before to my students, and I love it. I use it all the time. Megan. Bethanne's book, yet the site does not reference purchase as a hard copy or a PDF. May I please ask, which is it? Being in Spain, ordering a hard copy is a bit bothersome. That's a great question, Megan. I ordered it in hard copy, and as far as I know, that's the only format it's available in, but I'm not 100% sure on that. If the website doesn't say, I think you would assume it's just a hard copy one. You honestly might email Bethanne and ask her that question. I don't know if that's a thing she could do in future or make available. I'm not sure, but it might be worth asking. That's a great question, Megan. Juliana, this quilting pattern is a bigger scale than some of the other patterns that you do. Any tips for success with this larger design? You know, it is a bit bigger, Juliana. You're right. Some of the feathers are long. However, the quilted area, the biggest spaces are about an inch. Some of my feather plumes are about 1.5 inches wide. So there's not large unquilted areas. So I don't have any massive other points. I do like where there are thick seam allowances where I can stitch those down well. But because I was the piecer on this quilt, as I was piecing it, there were a few things that I did that helped with a flat quilt. And that was like spinning the seams. You know how when you do a 4-patch, you can make the seams sort of twirl and they lay flatter than going to one side and then to the other side. Knowing that was done really helps with this. Even where there are seam allowances, they don't pick up as much as they could. I think that that's important when you're thinking about what you're quilting. So I don't really have a tip for it other than to think about it when you're deciding on your quilting design. If there are super bulky seams, I wouldn't go with a really generously spaced design, or they're going to end up being unquilted and not getting stitched down, if that makes sense. Savannah, this quilting design would be terrific practice for spineless feathers too. It absolutely is. And it's good practice for having to elongate that one side of them. They're very long. They're 7 inches probably long. You know, a lot of that curves right in, but they're big. And that's a learned skill, but it's just another way to learn to manipulate feathers and work with them. You're right, it's great practice. And love the more plump feathers. Also love that you're okay with not ripping out the prior ones. Yeah, sure am. Megan, it does make sense, and I'm really liking the chubbier plumes. Thank you, Susan, showing us how well replanning pre-plans can come together. You're absolutely right. Pivoting moment. You can plan as much as you want, but sometimes you have to replan. It's true. Mr. Producer's hunting for a question that he lost. Here it comes. He found it. Karen, gorgeous. Would this work on a triple Irish chain? Oh, I think absolutely. Anything that's block-based. And in fact, in Bethanne's book, because it is a sampler smackdown, in most of her diagrammed examples, there's sashing between the blocks. And that's a slightly different look. But I've always done it on one like this one, where I can do it continuously from block to block. It's just a different look, but I think it would look fabulous on any Irish chain version. Yeah. Judy, where you're short, could you come back and do an echo? I probably could, Judy, but I'm not going to, and here's why. Looking at the unquilted space within a feather plume, and then looking at that unquilted corner, the unquilted corner is not significantly larger, so it's not going to stand out like, I missed quilting there. I just like it better when the plume goes right into the corner, right? That's why I'm not undoing it, because it's not bad. It's not a mistake. It's just not as good as it could be. So on the next ones, I'll do it as good as I can make it. That's all. Sherry, when doing all over feathers, I tend to get stuck with no way to continue. I tried echoing, but it doesn't seem to work well. Typically, I just break thread and start again. Any tips to avoid that? Well, I'm curious, Sherry, have you in fact taken my class? Because I talk about how you move around the top of the quilt. It's basically a giant meander. And then I would be practicing it honestly on paper so that you can practice heading toward a corner and sort of planning ahead mentally. Where am I going to turn so that I'm not, angling toward the corner, but I know that I've got to turn out of the corner, if that makes sense. So I would practice the movement on paper, on whiteboard, on plexiglass sheet until you kind of get that in your head, because that's really what it is you're planning ahead. Where do I need to go next, and how can I move in that direction when you're doing an all-over feather? I mean, breaking thread is not the end of the world either. Doris, do you ever have a problem with isocord untwisting as you quilt and then shredding by the needle? New problem for me. It has happened the odd time for me, Doris, so occasionally that I have to think there's some other factor than isocord thread, the brand. There's a factor, the fabric that I'm quilting on, for example. Just other things that come to play. But make sure that your needle is large enough that it's not shredding because of being forced through a needle that's a little too slim. So that's one thing I would check for. And maybe check with a new bobbin or a new spool of thread and see if you get a different result. But I don't think the fault lies with the thread. I think there are so many other factors, because it only happens very, very occasionally for me. Nelva, do you know what size needle you're using for the thread you're using? I do. I have a universal 90/14 on right now. And it is a Schmetz brand. It's not like a pro or a specialty needle in any way. Tap, I love this pattern. I'm going to be doing a quilt that this will be perfect for. Good. I was going to do Baptist fan, but this will work so much better. It's another option. Baptist fans are lovely too, but if you've got one to practice this on, that's great if you try it and see how it works out for you. Judy, does that chalk pen come in different colors? It does, Judy. My personal feeling about chalk, though, is any colored chalk is apt to leave colored residue. So I know that it comes in blue. It may come in others. I know that it comes in blue, but I have never used that on my quilts because I don't ever use colored chalk on my quilts because that coloring, I'm afraid, will leave colored residue. Now, you try it out for yourself. If it's made for sewing, and they promise that it will remove or whatever, try it out for yourself. But that's my longish answer. Sue, I use the chalk pen with Iron Away Pounce in it. Oh, interesting. Okay. I just have the chalk pen with King in it. And I often honestly use white school chalk as well that I've just run through a pencil sharpener to get a bit of a point on it. That works super well too, but I do not use colored school chalk ever because that was never intended for fabric, right? And it will leave a waxy residue in your fabric for sure. But the white school chalk is absolutely safe. Okay, I'd like to see the back of this finished quilt to see the effect on the light backing. Okay, mental note, I do try and always post pictures, although it's often a week or 10 days later, on social media of the project, and I'll put a picture of the backing as well so that you can see that effect, because it is quite fun. And that's where you'll best see that serpentine look for sure. Pat, I love how your stitching pattern perfectly complements your quilts and fabrics. Good. It looks like an antique quilt. Off the subject a bit, what is the name of the quilt pattern on the wall behind you? It's gorgeous. Easy peasy. It's by, I can't remember if it's K Facet personally or the K Facet Collective, and it's called Bowls and Vases. And I purchased it as a kit, so it's all their fabrics too. And I absolutely love it as well. Nancy, would that make a good color for a man's quilt? I presume you mean the quilt that I'm working on today, Nancy, the caramels and reds. Absolutely it would. It's a warm, homey, cabiny sort of feel. Absolutely. Many of the fabrics in here are from my stash, so you won't be able to repeat them, but you can repeat the feel for sure. Yeah. Laura Gray's music. How do you keep from being distracted by the prints in the quilt? For example, quilting a feather over a fabric with feathers in it. Oh, okay, apparently there's a part 2 or another one that relates. Mary, I have trouble keeping my train of thought. I go good, then I lose the direction. Oh gosh, great questions. I don't know how to say other than it's practice. Because I love edge-to-edge quilting, so much of my quilting does not relate to what's printed in the fabric or even to the piecing of the quilt. So I've, over the years, just trained myself to almost ignore it, right? To think of it as a flat piece, and I'm laying my quilting design over it. So work on that mentality. Like, don't be viewing the fabrics or even the piecing particularly as you're quilting. Just think of it as an 8-inch block, and away you go. You know, if like, for example, my white chalk on here is difficult to see even for me. So either mess with the lighting or mess with what marking tool you're using to make it more visible, because that might help too. When you have something that catches your eye a little more brightly, that will help to keep you focused on where that spine should be too. Jackie, do you prefer new needle each quilt, or when should a needle be changed when doing heavy quilting on larger quilts? I don't, you know, necessarily put a new needle in for every quilt. Often I will, like if it's a batik quilt, they wear on a needle faster. That's about the only time I change it every quilt. But typically, I will just change it when I start to hear popping when it's entering the fabric, or if I'm having tension difficulties, the first thing I do is change the needle. So in practice, that probably works out to every 2 or 3 quilts or something like that. I don't really clock it. I don't just change it out with a new quilt, but if something's going wrong at all, first thing I always do is change that needle. It's the easiest, quickest, least expensive fix to many problems. Michelle, I used a yellow chalk on a quilt and it turned my glove fingertip yellow and will not wash out. I've washed them twice. I'm pretty sure it washed out of the quilt though. And see, this is the thing that we never know. Different fabrics are different. Like even 100% cotton fabrics vary. The type of ink perhaps that's used, maybe the process that's used to print them. So it's impossible to say with 100% assurance, yeah, this one will work, and no, this one won't. So I choose to go the safe route and not use the colored chalk. I'm so glad it washed out of your quilt, but you can see the difficulty if it stains your finger yellow, your glove finger. Yeah. Okay, that's it for questions. One more sip of water and we're up and away. I think what we'll do, you guys, is quilt one more double row segment, take questions again, and that'll be it for today's episode. We'll try and do a roving camera so that you can see one snowball really well, and I will, of course, take pictures and post them. But the quilt is 9 squares long, so I'm going to be here a little while quilting this. I won't keep you guys here for all the hours. Oh, haha. I know what we haven't done. We haven't chalked the line in. I can't believe none of you told me that. Usually you're so good about reminding me things. I'm going to go ahead and move Stella. It will be easier to mark if she's not anchored on there. And I will move her to the other end so that you guys can see the marking process. When I'm quilting all over type designs, I tend to alternate ends of the quilt that I start at. On this one, that doesn't matter nearly so much because my design is going a specified way. It's not quite like your sit-down machine where that will twist the quilt because it's all anchored so firmly. But you certainly could. You certainly could start with the next section, you know, here and working your way this way. Up to you, but not essential. I am, however, looking at my previous feathers and making sure that I've got my alternating curve happening, because that's important to my little secondary design. This time I'm going to chalk these lighter ones a little more heavily. Just double check that this is right. Yep, it is. I just wanted to refer back to my earlier One of the Susans is asking if I've messed up my design, and the honest truth is, I couldn't say with 100% surety no, but I don't think so. So my blocks that are above each other have the curve oriented in the same way. My angle is where they alternate. That's why I was looking back, because I kind of had that same question, and I believe I've gotten it right. But as you all know, I have made mistakes on the show before, and you all have caught them. If you are enjoying this, I'd love if you'd give the show a thumbs up. That really helps me to get viewed by more quilters, and by all means, feel free to share it with your friends. If you subscribe and smash the little bell, you will get a notification whenever I do go live. And I do endeavor to give a day or two heads up whenever I'm doing one of these live shows as to what the quilt is and what the topics will be. So you can get that advance notification by signing up for my newsletter, and that you can do at my website, StitchedBySusan.com. You'll get a little pop-up that'll invite you to join my newsletter mailing list. Generally, these episodes air twice a month, generally on Friday mornings and at 9 a.m. Pacific time. I keep checking with my previous row, and I think I've got it. I think I've got it right. A side note about scrappy quilts while I'm marking. Years and years ago, I was making a red and white quilt as a gift. And I went into a fabric store and I was shopping for these reds. And I had a selection of them laid out on the table. And the sales lady, her name was Chris, she came and talked to me, and she really encouraged me to branch out much further with my reds. And the way she described it is that's how you get sparkle and life in a quilt, is by having a broader spectrum. So that really came into play when I was choosing fabrics for this quilt. My reds, for example, that are in here go from quite orangey pinky reds all the way up to maroon, almost toward blackish reds. And so that huge variety is what really gives it sparkle. Interestingly, I did the same thing with the tans and caramels. And one of the fabrics that's in here, can you guys see? You'll see it as I quilt over it. There's one, here's one, here's one. The background of them is white. And, you know, I looked at it as I was piecing the quilt and thought, gosh, that stands out a little bit. And in some ways, I look back now and think, I wish I had pulled that fabric out. I wish when I saw that I had undone it. But I didn't. And I'm going to leave it. And now it's getting quilted over with caramel thread, so it's going to take on more caramel tones anyways. So be it. But you live and learn. But over the years, I have really stretched myself in that way. When I do scrappy things, I have a pretty free hand, inviting all the cousins and relatives. And I like that look. It does really make a quilt sparkle. Okay, we are ready to quilt. Look at my bold white lines this time. Heavy hand with the chalk. Someone is asking apparently if we could reverse the direction of the feathers each row, or would that mess up the design? I do think that would interrupt your viewing of the design. You guys judge. When I post pictures, and especially of the backing and where you can see it as a secondary effect, I do think the feathers all kind of lean or flow in one direction, and you'd really be interrupting that. But hey, you try it on your quilt. Let me know what you think. Oh, we're still on basting stitch. We don't want that. Here we go. So while I'm quilting away on this, and I have a captive audience, have you yet seen that Mr. Producer and I are hosting a machine quilting cruise? Yes, indeed we are. January of 2025, so a full year away. And Bethanne, whose design is featured today, is one of the featured teachers on the cruise. I'll be teaching some classes, and also Sam Alberts, and her business name is Quilting Curve Studio, and that's where you can find her online. So the three of us are really working together to create a lineup of classes that we've published some general ideas of what our class content will be, but we're all still working on the material because we want it to be some new and fresh material, and we also want to find a cohesiveness. So Bethanne does a lot of she's an artist, so she does incredibly beautiful quilting and quilted coats with couch thread and many, many massively artistic, award-winning quilts, right? So she does intricate, beautiful stuff. Sam is a little more contemporary in her style, so you'll see a lot of line work, for example, in her quilts, and just some really original quilting ideas, and she does a lot of custom quilting. And then there's me. I do a lot of edge-to-edge or couch quilts type quilting, more maybe even utilitarian, you might call it. And so we have these very differing styles, and we want to create an experience that's very well-rounded for those of you who come, so that you can take what you learned in one class and apply it in another one and see it all come together to really expand your quilting horizons. So, all that said, cruise is in the Caribbean. I never get straight the exact stopping points, so I'm going to send you to the website to look for those if you want to see exactly the places where we're going. There will be classes, by and large, are on the at-sea days, and then the in-port days is where you get to take advantage of basically a Caribbean holiday, right? And do some of the excursions that the ship is offering, that sort of thing. So yeah, January of 2025, we are working on an action-packed, quilting-packed experience. It is all machine quilting, so it's not sewing machine based. We're not piecing quilts. And there is not going to be hands-on opportunities at the long arms. What we are going to have is an excellent cameraman along, so that the close-ups of the machine work and everything that we're teaching will be shown on the big screen for you, and we are recording all the classes, so you get to take them home and watch them again and again at home and practice the various techniques on your machine at home. So that's how that's going to work. Yeah, we are quite stoked and looking forward to it. Mr. Producer, I know, will have put the website link into the chat window by now. It's on my social media, it's on my website. SBS Experiences. And the ship we're cruising on is called the Equinox. So, cruise name is Quilting on the Equinox. Anywhere you see that, you can find more information. The three of us, Bethanne, Sam, and myself, are also all entrepreneurs in our quilting. It is our business, it is our livelihood. And so, in addition to the more typical quilting classes, we're also going to have some business breakout sessions. These are, well, I mean, all the classes are optional, but the business breakout sessions are just kind of a happy bonus. You're getting great value for the quilting classes, but if you're interested in building a business with your craft or hobby, there will be lots of information about that as well. Things like Sam's going to talk about building and storing and accessing a video library. The gentleman, Clement Lai, who is our videographer, is going to be talking about lighting and capturing video in your home studio. We hope to have a business coach there as well, who's not necessarily a quilter, but has a ton of ideas just regarding building visibility and a business. So one of the things that I'm going to present on is photographing your quilts, because photographing quilts is a whole specific skill set, much different than photographing, say, landscapes or people. And so I've got some great tips for that. So those types of things will be smaller, more informal business breakouts, we're calling them. So if that's something you're interested in, that is another thing that we'll be offering. And we're at a bobbin thread. Perfect timing. Look at that, just when I was between sentences. Okay, if you're new here, I'll let you know this is my usual way of running out of bobbin thread, just letting her go till it runs out. At that point though, when I look back, I can always see the last few inches did not have good tension, which is to be expected because there's no tension on the bobbin thread, right? The last 6 inches. So I have to undo a little bit. That's always the case, and that's just the price of it, in my opinion. In this case, I have to undo a few inches. It's not always that long. I typically will tend to go toward a point because that's where the machine will automatically have taken smaller stitches at a point. It will be more secure, and also it's much easier to camouflage the join. So I am going to proceed back to a point. It would be difficult to make this the arc of a feather plume smooth. So I'm just going to go ahead and rewind a few inches to the point. If I could get my hand organized, you could see me undoing. I've talked about this in other videos, but how I unpick stitches, you know, I just do it as kind of automatic, but when people see me, they're like, how do you do it that fast? And the answer is in how you hold the thread. I'm pulling hard. Here's my stitching line. I'm pulling away from it and up a little so that it lifts. Can you see this? It's lifting the bobbin thread. Mr. Producer's getting some better photographs. Oh, that's the one I thought we were on. Okay. Here's my stitching line, okay? I'm pulling the fabric straight out from it, although I'm moving it a little so you can see. And then I'm lifting a bit, about almost a 45-degree angle. And when I pull hard on that, it literally pulls up my bobbin thread, and I can see the loop right here. When I'm not on camera, I can literally just run my seam ripper back and forth across. Do you see that? And it just grabs that little loop. But I'm pulling on this thread just short of breaking point. Anyway, this is not intended to be a dissertation on undoing. But that angle makes all the difference. Pulling out from the stitching and then upwards a little bit, and it just starts pulling those loops up. And here we are at the point of our feather. So you guys will hardly be able to see this. My point is right in here. I've left a couple stitches. I'm going to start my new thread right in the point, overlap those couple stitches, and continue on into the feather. Not only is a point a great place to join threads, but also seam allowances are a great place because you've got multiple thicknesses of fabric. Anchoring your little tiny stitches there is really going to hold securely, and that's a good thing. So that's what I look for when I'm going to splice the thread. A corner, a point, and a seam allowance. And if I can do both, great. But at least one or the other. Oh, I guess I can't pull up the bobbin thread. There is no bobbin thread. Duh. Okay, I dropped my blue seam ripper right there, so I know where to come back to. I've already got a bobbin wound, so I'm just moving off to the side to replace my bobbin. The machine doesn't really show here, does it? I'm going to go ahead to the other end because I'm going to put a drop of oil in too. And you guys will kind of be able to see it. I don't always remember to oil with every bobbin, but I try to at least do it every second one. On my machine, all I have to do is pop that little plate off, place 1 drop of oil in, and make it run for a second. And I've got my stitch regulator on, and this is my little camera, so watch this. If I unthread the needle, turn my machine on, okay, and run my hand over that regulator, it starts stitching. Bingo! Not every machine behaves in the same way to do that, but if you've got any kind of stitch regulation or cruise control on your machine, I bet you can figure out a way to make your machine do that too, to distribute the oil. That's it. That's oiling right there. And I will take a second to start my new bobbin winding too. My machine has a bobbin winder built in, and it's a separate motor from the stitching motor, and so I can do them at the same time and still get really great bobbin tension. So I just always start it up, and it's winding and will be ready for me when I'm ready to go. Remember the blue seam ripper? That's right where we're starting. That's important in this quilt. Can you imagine how long I'd have to hunt otherwise for where this little splice is? Pull up my bobbin thread, take a few stitches right across that seam allowance. I like to leave my thread tails until I've stitched a little ways, so I'm just going to leave them there for the moment and I'll come back and trim them. I'm just going to look ahead, see where I need to go next, make sure I've got my little GPS is working here. My navigator. I'm going to take a second and trim my thread tails. We do have the close-up camera on. Here's a good look at my little scissors. Am I in the camera? There we are. I'm in the shot. Trying to get in front of a fabric where you can see them. Hysterical. Okay, Mr. Producer's changing it. Bless his heart. See my little tiny scissors? These are by Kai, but there are probably others out there, but I love that they're tiny. I love that they have a curved blade, and also they're a little bit blunt. So I'm not worried about catching fabric, right, with them. They are the best little tiny snips. Love them. Okay, on to stitching. I'm pretty sure a bunch of you are going to ask me more specifics on those scissors, so I might as well give them. It's their 4-inch snips, but be specific about the blunt tip because they also make them with a sharp tip. So the blunt tip and the curved. Thread I just stitched in. When I remember, I like to enter this curve by doing my first feather on the wider side. Because my spine is curved, it's super duper slim on the slimmer side and hard to fit a graceful feather in there. So I find it easiest to put the first plume in the wider side. I have not remembered that each and every time, and I don't think it's the end of the world. But when it works, it's great. We are live streaming this on the 12th of January, and a couple of days ago, maybe the 10th or the 9th, I posted a reel about lighting in your studio when you're working on something that it's really difficult to see your stitching. So this does not refer so much to your marked chalk lines, but your stitching. So if you're having trouble with a quilt like this, as I'm honestly having trouble today, seeing because of the busyness of the fabrics and just somehow the quality of the print is difficult to see your stitching on. An easy fix is to turn all the room lights off. I forgot to pull the bobbin thread all the way up. Let's try that again. Turn all the room lights off and then create a strong side light, basically casting a shadow. So for me, that's a freestanding floor lamp that I just stand to the side. It's got like a gooseneck top on it, and so I bend it quite low down, so it's literally casting light across my quilt. That can be very helpful. So if you're having real trouble seeing where you're driving, have a look at that reel that I posted. That's why I gave you the dates, so that you can hopefully find it. In early January of 2024, and it is super, super helpful. I didn't do great in this one in getting my feather plume in the corner. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Again, chiefly because my spacing for the quilting is fairly consistent, so having an unquilted corner is not going to stand out. It's not going to catch the eye of the viewer. This quilt was really fun to piece because it's got a lot of opportunity for strip piecing, making things in multiples. So even these little 4 patches, for example, we sewed long, like with the fabric, pairs together, and then chop, 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 subcut them up, and then, you know, sort of threw them in a bag and tossed them all around, and then matched them up with others. I keep doing that because I'm talking and not thinking, and I keep not pulling up that bobbin thread. Hang on a sec while I start that again. Anyway, all that to say, it was a fun piecing project. That's my kind of piecing. I like, you know, being efficient and whatever, getting it done quickly. But after I made this one, I was like, I would really love to try this in a totally different look. This feels like a quite traditional quilt. The palette, yeah, just the colors, and hence I'm quilting it in a more traditional type design, but I would love to try this in brights. So maybe instead of the browns and caramels, maybe I would do silvery grays and charcoals. And maybe instead of the red, I'd pick one or more, you know, brighter colors and just make a very contemporary quilt. I'm very fond of Alison Glass fabrics, and I can just see it in some of her brights. One of these days, might get another one made. My heavier chalking is certainly helping this time around. I'm really pleased with how this is turning out. Really pleased. Again, if you're enjoying this, if you're finding the tips helpful, please do give this episode a big thumbs up. If you have a moment, share it with any quilting friends. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you receive notifications whenever I'm going live in future. Speaking of going live, again, this is airing in early January, mid-January 2024. The previous week, I've been going live a number of times with updates on a quilted coat that I am making. So I quilted basically huge chunks of fabric and then cut out the coat. And there's been some stories and some pivots along the way. So if you're interested in that at all, thinking of making your own quilting coat or just interested in the process, just check back on my YouTube lives the first 10 days or so of January. And in fact, the coat is not finished yet, so there will be more of them as I work toward the finish line on that. But it's been a fun process. They are all named Making a Quilting Coat and then what the thing was I was working on that day, so you can search for them pretty easily. Making a Quilted Coat. Well, we are nearing the end of this pass. So again, I think I've covered all the topics, that relate to quilting this design. So I think after this pass, we'll call it for today's show. But please, do feel free to type in any questions you have, any comments. I don't think of everything, so I love hearing from all of you. If you have other suggestions or things that you've tried in the past in these episodes, it's so fun to be able to get together virtually like this. So let me know. And don't forget, put QQ in front of your questions so that we can indeed find them and refer back to them and pull them up on the screen. I'm not sure yet what the next quilt that I'll be doing live is. So again, best way to know what's coming up is to sign up for my newsletter. I try and send information out a couple days in advance as to what the project will be and what some of the topics are that I anticipate talking about. And so easiest way to do that is on my website, StitchedBySusan.com. You'll get a little pop-up that invites you to sign up for my newsletter. As always with these episodes, they are aired live, and the whole intention is just to invite you into my studio while I work. They're not classes particularly, and so the quilting projects, as you can see with today's, they're not necessarily planned with visibility in mind. They're things that I'm working on, literally working on. They're frequently client quilts, and so I'm just inviting you into my studio to watch as I'm working, and I just chat about the decisions and the processes and the thoughts while I go. There's some thread snips bobbing around. I'm not stopping for anyone. Not even thread snips. I'll brush them off later. When possible, I'm making my little stopping at the end of these blocks line up with the starting of my previous pass. All that will just help to make it appear as seamless and all over as possible, you know, for the feathers to just flow in an unbroken wave. Again, the marking is helpful for that because you know where you're aiming, because those mark lines match up. So the idea for this feather design is from a book by Bethanne Nemesh. And I've asked her for her permission to air this on YouTube. So her book is called Sampler Smackdown. You can find Bethanne at whitearborquilting.com. All of her books are available for purchase there. And this particular book has this idea and a ton of others for overlaying a quilting design basically on blocks, on sampler style blocks is the theme of that book. And so rather than doing custom quilting, you know, with piecing in mind, you're just looking at block by block, and in many cases in the book, you're looking at the whole quilt and kind of creating this secondary design that lays over the top of the whole quilt. And it's really a genius way of approaching quilting. It's far, far, far less time consuming than a true custom quilt, but a little dressier than an overall or edge-to-edge design. Adds that little something special. I don't know if you guys noticed there, but I fairly badly quilted over the previous feather. And guess what Susan is not undoing? In part because I just don't undo small things like that on a busy print, but also because the way that I'm quilting these feathers, there are these 1/8 inch kind of echoes, you know, between them, spacing between them, and it really just looks like that because I overlapped by about 1/8 of an inch. But no one is going to notice that crossover of stitching. I promise. I can't even see it anymore at this point. It's that well camouflaged. Okay, we have one more block. Just one more. And I'm trying to remember as I go, when I'm near the outer edge of the quilt, to be leaving about 1/4 inch between my quilting and that basting line again, just so that it won't get cut off when I attach the binding. Have I remembered in every case? No, I have not. But it does look nicer, a more polished finish, if you can remember to do that. Okay, that's the end of that pass, you guys. That's 4 rows out of 9 done. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the time involved. And of course, when there's less talking, there's more quilting that gets done too. But you can see how this is really an efficient way to cover a quilt top with something that's a little bit special, a little bit elevated, and yet not horribly, horribly time consuming. This is very doable in a not too long day of quilting. So I'm pleased with that. For a 72-inch square quilt, that's great timing. The marking is simple, it's minimal, it only takes minutes also, and produces a really fun result. Okay, Mr. Producer, sir, do we want to try a roving camera so that we can see one of these blocks? Okay, so we have to do a wee bit of fiddling with cameras. Yeah, go ahead and pull a question up for me and we'll talk for a minute on the main camera. Let's see what you guys think of this. Okay, Juliana, thank you so much for doing these episodes. In a past episode, you had tension issues with just one fabric in a scrappy quilt. I had a similar issue. Seeing you address it helped me address it. Yeah, in your project. Great. I'm glad that was helpful. And, you know, that is kind of my point with these episodes, Juliana, is just to show you guys my quilting as it happens, as it rolls out in real time. You know, quilting is seldom absolutely runs to script or to plan. Well, I wouldn't say seldom, but it often deviates. There's often other things going on and things that come into play. So I'm grateful that was helpful to you. And that's really my goal, is to make this more doable for you. Okay, we've got another camera. See, here it is. And now we're going to be looking. I'm trying to figure out which is a good one for you guys to even see it on. It's so difficult to see on any of these printed fabrics. But you get the idea, don't you? How that whole feather is just laid across the whole block. On the printed ones, you really can't even see it. Well, we can't really see it on the backing. Don't get dizzy. See, there it is on the backing, but there's... I think we'll hang on for pictures for a larger view of it. But I also think once it is released off the long arm rails and you look at the quilt as a whole, particularly if you stand and look at it toward the light, that's when you start to see that whole secondary picture. Okay, we can take that one off, I think. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I really do think that when I release the quilt off the long arm rails and you lay the thing out flat, that you'll start to see that serpentine look and just the overall secondary quality of the design. So once again, huge shout out to Bethanne Nemesh. Again, this is from her book, Sampler Smackdown, in which she gives this idea in detail and many, many, many others. A lot of them have to do with feathers, but some really original ways to think of a whole quilt or blocks and areas of a quilt and lay that secondary quilting design over the whole thing without the stitching in the ditch, without the backtrack feathers, so it goes so much faster, but still has this special look that we're always going for in our quilts, aren't we? Okay, any more questions that we want to talk about? Lots of questions. Okay, let's go. Robin, do you ever have trouble with the isocord thread being too slippery to stay on the bobbin? I was struggling with this when I used it the first time. I assume you mean, Robin, when you're starting to wind the bobbin. So a couple things I want to say about that. One is pull that tail of your thread and give it some winds, like 7 or 8 or 10 winds around the bobbin first. And where your thread is coming from your holder and onto your bobbin, wrap your tail around behind it once. So you're kind of just getting a crossover of threads on the bobbin. That can help. And then go around to the cutter if you're using a machine similar to mine. I mentioned in the beginning, I am in the process of putting together a group of videos called Know Your Machine, and the first one is going to be releasing this coming week in January, and hopefully each week thereafter. So they're short little videos. They do apply to my Bernina machine, but a lot of the points will apply across the board, even to your domestic machine. But there is one on bobbin winding in which I show all those things I just talked about in detail, because there are ways to manage that slippery thread a little bit. So yeah, hope that helps a bit. Carol, batting related, can I line dry a quilt with wool batting? Absolutely you can. Line drying it or laying flat is honestly the best way to dry wool batting, in my opinion. You can put it through a dryer, but you're apt to get a little bit more shrinkage. Megan, Susan, when you approach the beginning stitching at each earlier quilting pass, how far do you stitch over those stitches? Not very far at all, Megan. I started the earlier pass right in the corner of the block, and I try to end the current pass right in the corner too. I just want to meet up. I don't want to be, offset by 1/4 of an inch is all I'm going for. If I overlap a stitch, it's fine, but I don't try to. Sherry, I like the contemporary idea. Not the biggest fan of feathers. Like you said, very traditional. Wonder what your quilting would be like on a more contemporary quilt. I honestly don't know yet, but I think it would be a fun experiment, Sherry. How many quilts can I make? To make a contemporary quilt and to lay these feathers over top. This is not a traditional way of quilting feathers, right? So it would be a kind of mix. It would be fun to experiment with, but who knows? If and when I ever get around to doing that, I might quilt something totally different and contemporary on it. Tammy, did you make a spine first? I did not, Tammy. It is just an understood or suggested spine. So I drew the spine with my chalked line, and all my feathers are merging right into it so that a lot of the stitching comes up to it, but I did not stitch it first. And in fact, it's not fully stitched. My stitching does not overlap, so the whole spine is not necessarily stitched. It's just suggested. Pat, it would be so fun to see your sister's finished quilt next to yours. You know, we'll try, Pat. I don't know that they'll get side by side, but through the magic of the digital world, we could put our pictures side by side, couldn't we? We'll try and do that for you guys when they're both done. Jen, joined late today. Did you mark the quilt ahead of loading or better to mark as you go? You could do it either way, Jen, but because I'm working in rows anyway, I opted to just mark as I go. Now, that said, I do have to look back at what's already been quilted to get my curves because I'm alternating them as they angle down the quilt, right? So I have to be careful to know that I've done them right. So you might want to do it beforehand just so you can see the big picture. Chalk markings tend to come off with handling, right? So that's another advantage to doing it when it's loaded, is that chalk stays more vivid and more clear. Savannah, are the classes included with the price of the cruise or separate? They're included, Savannah. So two things. There is a discount if you're a non-quilter. So if you're bringing a friend or a husband along that's a non-quilter, they get a discount. But in the cruise package, the classes are all included. We tried to make this, there were so many ways to go, right? We tried to make it foolproof. So the package includes the quilting classes and it includes a basic drinks package. I don't know if you've been on cruises before, but that's like soda and coffee and tea are not included in your food. So we've included the basic drinks package in ours and included a basic Wi-Fi as well. So you can at least email and check for things. You definitely can't live stream shows like this, but it gives you some access. So that's all in the bundle included in the package. So it's one price. We tried to make it as foolproof as we could. Okay, that's it for questions. Okay, great. You guys, thanks so much for joining me. As always, these live and unscripted episodes are aired live stream, right? So you're getting things happen as they happen. You watched me run out of bobbin thread in this one, and I just work through those processes and let you see how this goes down in real time and with real problems and real decision making in my studio. So thank you very much for joining me. I'll be doing another one later in January. Sign up for my newsletter if you want advance notification of what the project is and what the topics will be. It's different every time because it's usually either my quilts or client quilts. So whatever I've got on hand, that's what I'll be quilting. So head to my website, StitchedBySusan.com, to sign up for that newsletter. And until next time, have a great day. Thanks for joining me in my sewing room today.